Well, good evening, everyone. It is 5:30, and so it's time to start the webinar that we have planned for this evening, which is to hear all about the conservation planning process that is offered to you for free voluntarily by USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. So welcome, welcome. Get started on the webinar's content in just a moment, but as we wait for a few others to trickle in this evening, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. All you've got to do is key in your name, your affiliation, and where you're located, if you so choose this evening. Chances are what brought you to tonight's webinar was a message from a partner organization, part of the Southwest Drought Learning Network. We call it the DLN for short. And where I work at the New Mexico Department of Agriculture, we're part of the DLN. So just a bit of background on this network, and certainly invite you to learn more about it via the link at the bottom of the screen. The network was created in 2020, and its purpose is simple. It's to gather information so that it can be shared with others in order to better prepare for, respond to, and recover from drought. Critical set of details that come together through the Drought Learning Network there, and certainly a strong connection to conservation planning. So a wide variety of members within the Drought Learning Network. I'll name just a few types of people who gather at the table. We've got hydrologists, climatologists, other people who work in the realm of science. There are federal and state government officials and tribal representatives, people from Extension, making sure that the good word gets out, and members of the public. So again, inviting you to transcribe that link at the bottom of your screen so that you can check out the Drought Learning Network and learn more about it, and perhaps send an email to be included in some of those communications. There are 5 teams who really come together to do the work of the Drought Learning Network. One of those teams I've highlighted for you on the screen is Drought in Agriculture. So that team gathers and talks about all aspects of how people working in agriculture can better prepare for, respond to, and recover from the drought. It is that team where the idea for tonight's webinar was born. And so we welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar, all about conservation planning. And because it's a wide set of people that have joined us this evening, that's all that's going to be discussed is conservation planning from NRCS, pure and simple. So if you came here for program information about NRCS programs like EQIP or CSP or another program, perhaps NMDA's Healthy Soil Program, that's not what's on offer tonight. Rather, we will keep it strictly focused on conservation planning from NRCS because that is the ticket to so many doors. So we'll really stay tightly focused on the conservation planning topic with NRCS tonight. We have a couple of speakers for you this evening. The first is going to be Kenneth Alcon. And as you see on the screen there, he's going to offer the perspective from NRCS. He's worked his way up to be the State Resource Conservationist for New Mexico's Office of NRCS. So we'll hear from him and go through some slides with Kenny so that you get a really strong sense of how the agency approaches conservation planning and get a bit of history on the agency as well. We'll also hear the other side of the coin, which is from an NRCS customer, a client. We'll be hearing from Schooley, who's joining us this evening from eastern New Mexico, where she and her family manage farmland. So I want to introduce Kenny to get us started this evening. He's a native New Mexican who grew up in northern New Mexico on a small cow-calf operation. Graduated from New Mexico Highlands University with a degree in business administration and finance, minored in environmental science, and also got a degree in range science from New Mexico State University. So a New Mexican through and through. He worked with the U.S. Forest Service as a range technician and a range management specialist, and then went to work for another USDA sub-agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. He's held several positions within NRCS, including Area Rangeland Management Specialist, District Conservationist, North Area Conservationist, and now the State Resource Conservationist. So a perfect person to walk us through the 9 steps of conservation planning. So Kenny, take it away.
Thank you very much, Katie, for that introduction. So good evening, everybody that's on the call. As Katie mentioned, this topic that we're going to be discussing is the 9 steps of conservation planning as NRCS does. And this is a process that is followed pretty much throughout the nation. Every state has a little bit of differences of how they do it, but the basic template of conservation planning in New Mexico should not be very different from Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, anywhere you go within the country. The 9 steps of conservation planning is pretty much how we work and interact with producers out there, whether it's a small landowner, large landowner, is kind of how we operate with the 9 steps of conservation planning. So Katie, next slide. Hit the enter again. So, you know, for those of you, a lot of times there's still that we're referred to as the Soil Conservation Service, and at one time we were known as the Soil Conservation Service. And you know, what's the origins of our agency? We were founded during the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. We were known, like I said, as the Soil Conservation Service. Next. We are a federal agency under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And next. And one of the key things that makes us unique as far as an agency and a USDA agency is that we work a lot with the local leadership in those communities. A lot of what we do is we work with our soil and water conservation districts to help us be the grassroots, the sounding board as to how and what resource concerns are needed to be addressed in a specific area. So, you know, that's what makes us pretty unique as an agency, is that it is local leadership, and we try to work with those different organizations to find out what's the best approach on what the resource concerns are, and when it comes to conservation planning. Next slide. Like I said, we do partner with a local soil and water conservation district. They are one of several partners that we partner with. We have a very good partnership, like, for example, the NMDA, NMACD, and other partners. We work with local, state, and federal partners when it comes to addressing, you know, complex resource issues, because a lot of times the issues that we have out there that we need to address may be from somebody's backyard all the way up to a watershed plan where we're looking at, you know, addressing multiple resource concerns that may be identified. So that's kind of a little bit of the history. Like I said, in a lot of cases, we're still known as a soil conservation, but currently we are the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That is our new name, but we do refer, like I said, a lot of folks still refer to us as a soil conservation. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just kind of the history. We were established to help with the severe erosion that happened during the 1930s during those Dust Bowl days. Next slide, please. So, you know, what is our mission as an agency? It's for us, we deliver conservation solutions. Agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. So as you all know, you know, this is a very vital role that we play, and all of us on this call play a vital role. It doesn't matter if you're a large producer or a small backyard producer, we all contribute to that of feeding, you know, a growing population. You know, we're hitting what, 9 billion people throughout the world. And, you know, in the United States is one of the leading agencies that helps, you know, on private lands. That's what makes us also unique, is that, you know, our mission is to work primarily on private lands. We have expanded that mission to work with other federal agencies, but, you know, our primary focus in most cases always with private lands. Not saying that we've got some really good partnerships with BLM, Forest Service, and other agencies. So, you know, this is a very vital role that we play, like I said, and there's no discrimination on the size of the operation, because every operation has its unique opportunities and challenges. Next slide. So our vision statement is a world of clean and abundant water, healthy soils, resilient landscapes, and thriving agricultural communities through voluntary conservation. And that's very key, is that, you know, we're all in this line of work because we want to leave, this is the way I always look at it, is we want to leave our natural resources in a better place than where we got them. We always want to improve on them so the next generation can improve on those, just like we've improved from those Dust Bowl days to where we're at today. We always want to be able to improve, but a very key statement in here is that it is voluntarily done. It's conservation, that we're not a regulatory agency. That's another thing, like Forest Service or BLM. We're not a regulatory agency. All of the assistance that we offer to landowners is on a volunteer basis. And like I said, every producer that comes through our offices is available to get this information. And the other thing is that all of this information is offered for free. There is no fee addressed for any of the work that is done through NRCS when it comes to a producer wanting some kind of technical assistance. And we'll get more into details down on the presentation. Next slide, please. So what do we at NRCS do? And you know, we work with farmers, ranchers, and other groups to conserve soil and other natural resources. And these are just examples of some of the practices that we do. We're not going to get into a lot of detail, but they vary from almost any natural resource that we have out there. We have a resource concern, and we also have what I call a toolbox or practices that we can address to help improve or address that resource concern that you may have. So like in that upper right picture there, that's an example of a very typical erosion control measure that we do. That's called a rock and brush dam. That's very typical in a lot of these little arroyos. As you well know, here in New Mexico, we don't have a lot of water, but when we get water, a lot of times it runs down into an arroyo or a gully, and you get these active head cuts. So this is a typical example of doing something like a rock and brush dam to where you address that soil erosion that's occurring on the landscape. You know, down in that bottom right picture there, that's a typical photo showing what we do as far as like forest stand improvement. You know, as you well know, we've been, this last summer, we were hit with some really large, in fact, the largest fire in New Mexico history burned this year, the Hermit Peak Cap Canyon fire. So we are also looking at, you know, some forest stand improvement projects here to help, you know, help with wildfire resource concerns, you know, wildfire hazard. And then we also work, you know, with wildlife. You know, it could be from water development for livestock. It could be for wildlife. Anytime we develop water in New Mexico, that is something that's very vital. Again, we're in the arid Southwest. So, you know, this is just an example of us putting in wildlife water that's beneficial, not just to wildlife, but to birds and to also livestock. Next slide. So what is conservation planning? And conservation planning is really a lot of information that is gathered. We'll get more into that, but it's a natural resource. If we're looking at problem solving and looking at what, again, as the process to address that resource concern. And it's all, again, I want to stress this throughout this, is that it's strictly voluntary. Nobody is going to force anybody to do something that they do not want to do. And in most cases, like I said earlier, a lot of the work that we do through NRCS is going to be on private lands. If we are working with those federal agencies, then of course we're going to be able to work with those agencies in conjunction to address whatever complex resource concern is out there. And it's based on the premise that the clients will make and implement sound decisions if they understand their resources, their natural resource concerns and opportunities, and the effects of their decisions. Because, you know, it's a cause and effect. You know, you do something, there's going to be a cause and effect. And part of our planning process, which is conservation planning, is to guide you through all of those 9 steps. Like the previous opening slides had the 9 steps of conservation planning. We're going to go into each one of those and kind of give you a broad, you know, we're looking at maybe not a 30,000 foot elevation view of it, but, you know, probably down at the 5,000 foot elevation view of what conservation planning is. Next slide, please. So this is the planning process. It says there, it's dynamic and it's interactive. And the key thing in this whole process is that it's got to be done on the ground with the producer. Like I said, whether it's a large producer or a small producer, conservation planning has got to be done on the ground in the field with that landowner. And this kind of breaks down our planning process. Like I said, this is the planning process that is used throughout the country. Every NRCS office follows these 9 steps that are laid out here. So, you know, in phase 1, you have the collection and analysis of data. You know, this is where you're going to determine the objectives, you identify the problems, you analyze the resource data, and you inventory. You got to find out what you actually, you know, what cards you're playing with. So that's kind of all in that phase 1 in that area there. Once we complete phase 1, we go into phase 2, which is a decision support process of it. This is where we're going to start formulating alternatives. We evaluate those alternatives, and then finally the landowner would make the decision as to how they want to implement and address those resource concerns. And then finally, you get into phase 3, which is the application and evaluation part of that conservation plan. So this is the part where you go in and you actually implement the plan based on all of these other steps that were done previously. And then at the end, and probably the part that we usually as an agency are probably need improvement, and I will admit that, is the evaluation of the plan. We don't have the time to actually, in some cases we do, but in a lot of cases, that's the part that we as an agency need to do a better job of going out there and evaluating the plan, how successful it was, whatever resource concern and whatever practice we recommended to address that resource concern. So this is very key. These are those 9 steps. We're going to get into each one of these in detail. So next slide, please. So, you know, at one time, we used to call it SWAPA plus H, but as things evolve, you know, when you're working with natural resources, things evolve. We've actually added E. So if you could just go through those for me. So the first one is S, that stands for soils. The W stands for water. The A is going to stand for air. The P is going to be for plants. A is going to be for animals. E, which is new within the last few years, is energy. And of course, the last one, the H, is the human part of it. So when we're looking at conservation planning, these are all of those factors that we're taking into account. We're looking at it from all of these resources right here, from soil to air to plant to animals. You know, energy is a new one. And ultimately, it's going to be the human, because that's very important. That human part of conservation planning is NRCS staff working with you as a producer. That's the human element of this to be successful. So when we're out there doing conservation planning, these are the things that a conservation planner should be looking at with you as a producer. Like I said, whether you're looking at a 30,000 acre ranch or you're looking at someone's backyard or someone's a hayfield down in the valley here in Albuquerque, this is what we're looking at it from all of these different resources out there. Next slide, please. So what's the first step that we do when we're out there? And again, this is all done in conjunction with you, the landowner, and that conservation planner from NRCS. This cannot be done from behind a desk in an office. Now, there's nothing to say that a planner may not have a map of your place, and maybe you sit down and look at a map, and the landowner can come in and start saying, well, I really need water here, or I have a real bad brush control problem here. Part of that planning process is going to be, I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if you're hearing all that, but I'm getting some bad feedback.
I am, and I think it's Casey, maybe muting your cell phone until we tee you up for your half of the presentation. I think that's where it's coming from, possibly.
All right, thank you.
Thank you both.
So again, we're going to go out there and we're going to identify problems and of course the opportunities. You know, in this case, you know, you're looking at a field and, you know, it probably is needing some cover on it. You know, organic matter may be something that is needed. So first thing we need to do is identify the existing resource problems and concerns, and then we're starting to formulate what are the opportunities, and also we're looking at what alternatives we can come up with. Next slide. So part of that is to identify those resource concerns. Then step 2 is to determine the objectives. Again, you as the landowners are in the driver's seat. We are just here to guide the process of those 9 steps of conservation planning. At the end of the day, in order for any of these conservation plans to be effective, the landowner has to have ownership in it. I can't stress that enough, because like I tell producers when I was working with them, this is your plan. I'm here to help you and guide you, but in order for this to be successful, you have to have ownership in it, and you have to have your, I say, stamp on it, because it can't just be from us going down, because then we would be regulatory, and this process is not. It's an interactive process. So during this step, we're going to work with the landowner to identify their objectives, and then us as the NRCS, and it could be a range management specialist. You're going to hear these terms. You're going to hear about a soil conservationist. You're going to hear range management specialist. All of these are just different titles, but they're all conservation planners. And that planner is going to guide you through this process to look at the needs, the values, the resource uses, and then looking at the on-site and off-site ecological protection of whatever resource concern you may have, and then others that may be identified during that planning process of conservation planning. Then again, this is a dynamic process. So a lot of times these objectives need to be revised and modified as new information is learned. Sometimes, you go and do an inventory, or you get soils information, water budgets, things like that. That's all going to come into play, but really those won't be finalized till step 4 on the planning process. But right here, we're just trying to determine, what do you want to do? What are your concerns, really, is what this means. Next slide. Then we inventory the resources. Here we have a really active head cut. Probably most of us here in this call in the arid Southwest, we're very familiar with this. This is very common throughout, New Mexico. This is an active head cut. This may be one of the resource concerns that the producer may have. In some cases, we may or may not have something in our toolbox to address it, but in this case, we're going to inventory and document those natural resources and their current on-site condition and effects. And then we're also going to look at it from, the economic standpoint, and then social considerations related to that resource concern. So in this step, we're just going out there and doing an inventory. For example, a big one that we do is, like, for example, we do a water budget. People come in and say, I need water. Well, how much water do you need? And part of this planning process is to determine what's the need. There's a want and a need. And our job with conservation planning is to give you what the need is. It may not be the Cadillac. And that's something that part of that planning process is. Sometimes we start off with, you may want the Cadillac, but we may not be able to get there right now, but I can give you the Toyota Corolla. And it may be piecemealing this conservation planning into it, because there is economic constraints on the producer. But the key thing is that we have to inventory what is on the ground. What are we trying to accomplish here? Next step. Or slide, sorry. So in step 4, what we're going to do as an agency, and this is part of that, is that we're going to analyze that data. We're going to study and clearly define what are the existing conditions out there from all of those previous things that we looked at, from soil, water, air, plant, energy, the human component. We're going to look at all of those when we're out there. So it's, in a lot of cases, when it comes to conservation planning, my experience has been that a producer will come in with a problem. They may say, I have a need for water. But when you go out there and you start looking at the resources, you start identifying other items out there that may need some assistance or may need to be addressed. So it's very important for us to, that there's a clear understanding of what's there, what can physically be done. One of the analogies that, here in New Mexico, the limiting factor for us in most cases is always water, and that's one of those that we're going to work the best we can with whatever resources you have available. In a lot of cases, we're working with landowners that may work off, for example, on acequia, and they have water that's based on runoff, and they don't have the water like on the east side where, you have wells and you can irrigate on demand when you want it. In other parts of the state, it may be only on a rotation, and we don't get the snowpack. So that's all part of this analyzing the data. We need to understand what can actually be done, because the last thing we want to do in conservation planning is set up anybody for failure, and we have a lot of expertise. So if we have someone here that does not have the information, maybe at that local field office level, then we are structured to where it would come up to the area level, and we'll go over some of how we're structured later on in the presentation, or it'll come up to the state office level. But we will get you the right answer to address whatever, if it can be done at that local level. Next slide, please. So, after this step, we're going to get into formulating alternatives. And again, one of the things that we as an agency are looking at from a different perspective is we used to have to look at the entire picture, and we still do that when we're planning, those conservation planners. But we're going to call it progressive planning. We used to call it an RMS, a resource management system. Those are no longer really, we're not really striving for those. We're looking at a progressive plan because, in a lot of cases, it could be an economic limiting factor. And we're as part of the planning process with the formulating of alternatives, for example, is my greatest need is water, but you also have some other needs. Well, maybe we just address the water situation, and that would be one alternative, but we're just going to address your water resource concern. But we've also identified you have maybe invasive plant brush control, let's say juniper, mesquite. Well, that's going to be where you make that decision. We're still going to guide you through that process, but we're going to formulate alternatives. Ultimately, again, like I can't stress enough, is you as a landowner are in charge of that plan, and you dictate what's going to get done. All we're here to is to guide the process, and we're here to give you alternatives, and we're going to give you practices to address whatever resource concern is out there. That this is going to help you make the best decision you can. You know, it's like I always say, you want to get as much information as you can to make an educated decision on your land. So we need to, again, like I said, the limits of the system. You know, in different parts of the state, you know, you're limited maybe by water. It could be economics. It could be control of land, those types of things. One thing that I'll try not to do is, I know we in the federal government are very notorious for using acronyms, and there is one there that says FOTG. That is our field office tech guide, and there's different sections, and everyone, if you ever want to find out whatever NRCS has to offer, from conservation planning to the programs that we're not really going to talk about too much tonight, is in this field office tech guide. You can also go to our nm.nrcs. There's other information there, but the field office tech guide is where we house all of the technical data. So like in part 2 of the section, that's where we have maps. Part 4 is where we have all the conservation practice, standard, and specs. Because everything that we're going to do as part of this conservation planning has to follow our conservation standards and specifications. And the way I look at it is, the specification is the one that tells you the 5 W's: who, what, where, and how. The standard is really what we as NRCS use to help us formulate the spec. It's kind of more for the planner to use, but those are all available to producers. We have to follow our standard and specifications. The other thing is that we're going to use the best management practices, BMPs, you know, and that could be a combination of, you know, one thing as part of our technical assistance, and we call that conservation technical assistance. That's what we're really talking about here. CTA, conservation technical assistance, is what we use to develop a conservation plan outside of the Farm Bill programs that we're not going to talk about very much here. So that's kind of the process that we use. And we're looking at, you know, best management practices. One thing that a lot of producers don't realize is when they come to us for conservation planning, in most cases, a lot of them are looking at structural practices. I need a fence. I need a well, you know, actually hard, fast structures. But there's a lot of non-structural practices that we do, like management practices. Prescribed grazing is a big one here in New Mexico. We have irrigation water management. We have pest management. So there's a lot of practices that are not specifically tied to an active practice. So that's part of this process. So part of the conservation planning process is, okay, we may have some structural and non-structural practices, but it's all part of that conservation planning process. And again, you know, we're going to be looking at all those resource concerns that meet, I call it SWAPA E and plus H. Next slide, please. So when we formulate alternatives, one of the things that, for example, here in this slide, I wanted to convey is that, you know, we want to give people, you know, alternatives. And for example, this is just a real basic one of how complex conservation planning can get, but how easy it can also be. So for example, in this example here, we have a producer or a client that wants to reduce the number of juniper trees in their ranch or their pasture. Well, as part of the planning process, that planner, there's different methods of how we're going to address that. One alternative could be we're going to do mechanical brush control. The other one could be we're going to use a prescribed burning. That's another method to address that resource concern. Then we have the chemical brush management with hand application. So that may be in a situation where maybe you don't have as much brush and maybe it's a smaller area. You may want to do it by hand and chemical. We may go down to one of these other ones that has chemical management aerially. It may be a large pasture where it's not feasible to do it by hand, but you can do it with aerially treating it with some type of chemical. Again, there's that RMS, that's a resource management system. We're not going to get into that. And then there could be a biological control method. It could be maybe some kind of insect that we have, like for knapweed, we're going to use some kind of insect to target that specific species. In this example, of course, there's not as to my knowledge, there isn't any type of biological treatment for juniper that we know of right now, other than the bark beetle that decimated piñons in the state a few years back. But so this is kind of one of those processes that we use, looking at it from the conservation planning standpoint. How, we have some producers that are not, I would say, are reluctant to use chemical. Well, then we go with prescribed burn. That's a natural process. That's part of that dialogue that you have with that producer. Or maybe it's mechanical. They don't want to use chemical. Then let's go with a mechanical brush control. But again, looking at it from an economic standpoint and looking at what's the most efficient way of trying to address that resource concern. And then, like I said, we have other agencies that we partner with, NMSU, the extension agents, with, of course, the SWCDs. We also use a lot of private TSPs that help us. In New Mexico, we haven't utilized a lot of these because they have to be registered under TechReg, and they're technical service providers, to where you could actually, if you wanted to get, let's say, an engineering design done, and it's taking maybe, because in NRCS right now we're short staffed on engineering, you could go to a technical service provider, as long as they're on the list, to help you maybe design irrigation, maybe a drip irrigation system. So that's something that is available as well, is maybe going through a technical service provider, and that would be something that we could do through one of our Farm Bill programs down the road. So this is just an example of how we can formulate, all of these different alternatives. This is just an example for brush control, but this would be true for almost any resource concern out there. If you're looking to address erosion, it could be a rock and brush structure like I showed earlier in that one picture. It could be a diversion. There's different methods, but this is just an example. Next slide, please. So, what's the next step? We're in step 6 of 9. So here's where we're going to evaluate those alternatives. And again, the key component here is having that producer landowner is always involved. Like I said, this is a process that is done jointly between that NRCS conservation planner with that individual landowner on the ground to evaluate, what alternatives they've come up with. And at that time, you have those conversations like we did earlier. How do you want to address this? I don't like doing chemical. Okay. Do you want to do it mechanical? Do you want to do it with prescribed fire? And then our part of that whole alternative is to discuss the pros and cons to each method that you're going to use. Then we look at it, like I said, we always provide no less than 2 alternatives and what fits the current situation. At the very minimum, like I said, we used to do what they call an RMS plan, a resource management system, where we evaluated everything. And sometimes that may be too much for a producer. Sometimes we got to start with baby steps, and it may be just one basic conservation plan to address one specific need. We'll still identify other resource concerns, but at the same time, we don't want to basically overwhelm a producer either. Again, you're in the driver's seat, the producer. We're there to guide you through that process. And you may want the Cadillac, you may want the RMS plan. And then afterwards, you may start taking bits and pieces and saying, well, I came in with this issue or concern, but after talking and meeting with you, actually, I think I want to address my initial resource concern, but I also like the idea of maybe addressing this erosion. Okay, well, that's part of that process of conservation planning. So we try to give no less than 2 alternatives. In some cases, there may be more, but usually we try to give at least 2 alternatives to that landowner, so they feel that, they can make the best decision that fits their operation the best. Next slide. So the next step is step 7, and this is where we actually go in and make decisions. And again, the NRCS planners are there to assist you, but they do not make the decision. Ultimately, this is your private land in most cases, like I said, and you're in charge. You're in the driver's seat. I want to emphasize that. So if you're ever in a situation where an NRCS planner is trying to, for lack of a better term, force you to do something, then you probably need to contact that supervisor, because again, it's voluntary. We're there to provide you the technical assistance. Again, it does have to meet our standard and specifications. That's part of, working with NRCS. You're going to have to follow our standards and specifications. But like I said, those things have been tried and true. They're used throughout the country. It's not just New Mexico that uses them. Every state is using those standards and specifications. So again, we're going to discuss those advantages and disadvantages for each alternative like we've been talking. And then we're also going to have to look at it. Part of this process of conservation planning is, and I know for a lot of folks, this may be, difficult, but we have to follow all state and federal laws. And part of that sometimes is we have to deal with maybe T&E species, wetlands. In New Mexico, wetlands isn't a big one, but T&E could be in some cases. But it doesn't mean that, we're just saying that we have to evaluate that. If you remember, we have animals. Part of that animals is evaluating maybe the T&E species, not saying that you can't do something, but we have to evaluate all of those species. The timeline, what's the best time to implement or avoid certain practices? Again, that could be tied to something, for example, with maybe a water right or things like that. Those are things that are discussed during this, making the decision for that basic conservation plan. And then it's necessary to document to proceed at this stage. We need to record what alternative. We'll have a discussion. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we document, because we all have short memories. We all have busy lives. And from the NRCS standpoint, these planners work with a lot of individuals. We need to make sure that we're documenting whatever decisions are made. So 6 months, a year later, I've had producers call me after 5 years. You remember when you were out here with me and we were driving around and you told me about this and that? I'm like, I vaguely remember us bouncing along your pasture, but I don't know specifically. But if I have tech notes, that's what we call them, I can go back and kind of refresh my memory. So it's very important to document those decisions. And it's just good for the landowner and it's good for NRCS. So that way we know because if there's turnover, planners come and go, there's a lot of turnover in our offices. Somebody can pick up that and say, oh, okay, we met with Mr. Smith. Oh, and you guys talked about these things, and this is kind of the decision you made. Now, is it changing? Again, it's a dynamic process. It may have changed. Your objectives may have changed. Maybe something happened now where, you had a wildfire. Maybe now the whole plan has to be relooked at. Those are the types of things we want to make sure we can document in this step 7. Next slide, please. Again, you as a producer, you choose to implement only part of an alternative or all of them. Like I said, you are in the driver's seat. Our process in conservation planning is to guide you through that process. If you, like I said, you don't want to do a certain practice or address a certain resource concern, then we document that and we move forward to what you really want to do. Like I said, in our day and age now, we actually call it progressive planning. We look at the whole picture, but then we may just end up doing little pieces at a time. You came in with water, maybe we address the water situation during this planning process. The next step may be we're going to do an irrigation system, or we're going to look at maybe replanting the field. Again, it's a progressive plan. It's dynamic. It's going to be evolving. It's not something that you shelve and do it once and shelve it. Things change, and that's part of this conservation planning process, is that dialogue between the producer and the NRCS planner. And again, we need to record in our assistance notes, and that's more for us internally, but it is a process that we're going to document whatever assistance, whatever was discussed out there. Photos are going to be part of that, maybe, of the planning process, those types of things. So next slide, please. So plan documentation. So what comes out of this conservation plan? So again, we're going to present all of these alternatives. We're going to go through all the resource concerns that were identified, and then we're going to prepare plan documents. One of the biggest assets I think that we provide, and I've heard this from a lot of producers, is we prepare a conservation plan map with soils information and ecosite information. A lot of people don't know what, that's one of the most basic tools that we can provide, which I think for a lot of producers, they really appreciate a topo map of their operation and ortho and a topo map. And then you overlay that soils information, because this helps them, oh, I didn't know I had this soil here. Now I understand why certain plants grow here and they don't grow here. All of that information is part of that conservation plan, is the maps, the soils, the ecological site description maps, ecosite maps. Then we prepare that conservation plan that'll have whatever practice it is. It'll have the practice standard and spec. In most cases, it's a specification. If it's something that needs to, go down the line to actually implement, for example, you wanted to put in a fence, we're going to do what we call job sheets. They're now called IRs, implementation requirements. It's a job sheet. That's what tells you this is how you're going to build a fence. It'll have sketches, diagrams, for example, on a fence, how wide to do the H-brace, the wire spacing. It will have all of that. That's all part of that conservation plan. And then, of course, we're going to discuss operation and maintenance. When it's tied to CTA, we're really going to encourage to do the maintenance on it, and operation and maintenance. That falls more into play when we're looking at it from a farm bill program, and you actually get into some kind of financial assistance program. But we always want to discuss the operation and maintenance, even in CTA, conservation technical assistance. We want to go over that operation and maintenance plan. And then, in some cases, if it's just a conservation plan, we can obtain signatures from, the landowner. So that way it's documented, provide copies to whatever other, a lot of cases we're working with maybe limited liability partnership, and there's more than one person. Maybe you give two people a copy of the conservation plan with maps and all of that other information. And then, the other part of this, and I know this is more for conservation planning, but in a lot of cases, opening up the door for CTA opens the door to other programs that NRCS has to offer. For example, farm bill programs like the Environmental Qualities Incentives Program, CSP. But really the basis of getting to that point is this conservation plan. That is pretty much the first step. That if we could get conservation plans written for all of these people, it would make our job with NRCS so much easier, because it's there, it's documented. It's just a matter of picking up that conservation plan, and now we go and say, okay, now you need the financial assistance part of it, but your conservation plan has that roadmap of what you want to do on that piece of land. Next slide, please. So in step 8, this is the plan implementation, and this is the process of carrying out whatever conservation treatment. You wanted to build a fence. We went through that whole planning process. We've gone through the job sheets. We've identified it on a map where that fence is going to be, all of those things. And then it's on the producer to go out there and implement the plan. And, part of that process of CTA and conservation planning is we always want to maintain basically that maintain contact with that producer. It shouldn't be a one and done. If a producer has questions on a conservation plan, they should feel free to call that. And if they have a question on maybe a job sheet, an IR implementation requirement, they should be able to pick up the phone and talk to that planner and say, I'm not understanding this here. Can you explain this to me? So that's all part of that dialogue that should happen of conservation planning. It is that rapport between having that relationship really with that conservation planner and that landowner, and part of the implementation of the plan, because ultimately it's the producer's responsibility to implement that plan. Next slide, please. So, I just wanted to kind of go over the distinct roles in plan implementation, because sometimes, and this can get a little more confusing. Right now, we're trying to stick to just conservation planning at CTA with no financial assistance involved. But the reality is that sometimes they get intermixed, the conservation planning with financial assistance. So here's kind of a real basic, next, please. What the planner role is, again, is to provide that technical assistance. That's very key. Next. Part of this whole conservation planning CTA is that NRCS will do all the survey, design, and layout of practices. So if you have an engineering, let's say you have a livestock pipeline, NRCS as part of that conservation plan, without any financial assistance, we can still provide you with all the survey, design, materials list, turnkey, to where you could go on your own without financial assistance if you wanted to be able to go and get that pipeline, installed, and it's at no cost. This is all pretty much done free, like I said. So that's part of that conservation planning. Next. Again, we're going to help develop that operation and maintenance plan. That's part of our standard and specifications. We want to make sure that whatever is done, and you as a landowner want something to be out there for a long time. Every one of our practices, you'll hear this a lot, is they have what we call a practice lifespan. Most of these things, we want them to at least meet. It's just like a car, you can depreciate it. Same thing with a fence. A fence has a 25-year, I believe 20 or 25-year lifespan. We want to make sure that it's properly operated and maintained. And we all know that a fence can last 100 years. Next. And then provide technical information for permit and applications. Part of that CTA and that conservation plan is, like I said, we have to follow all state, local, and federal laws. Is provide you the technical information. You got to call 811 before you dig. Those types of things are part of that conservation plan, because you'd be surprised how many people don't know that that needs to be done. Even if you're out there in the back 40, in the middle of nowhere, you're gonna wanna, you know, call 811. Next. And then, you know, again, assisting with the regulatory requirements, that's one of them. Next. And assisting monitoring and evaluation. You know, a lot of times where we as an agency, you as producers doing this, implementing these plans, is that we learn a lot. We learn what worked and what doesn't work. And you play a vital role in that. And that's part of that. Like I said, if there's anything that NRCS can probably improve on, is going out there and evaluating the plan after it's been implemented. Because we're so busy and we're so short-staffed, sometimes it's hard to go back and evaluate it. But you can assist us with that and say, you know what, this really worked or this didn't work. Next slide. So part of this plan implementation, as far as from the customer role or the producer's role, is the following. Again, you're in the driver's seat, you make the decisions. Next. You implement the plan or implements the plan. Next. Obtain permits and easements, that's going to be the responsibility of that landowner. And that's whether it's, you know, we're whenever we're doing even CTA, we're going to recommend that you obtain all permits and easements because it's part of our planning process. Next. Comply with all laws and regulations. You know, that's part of getting that technical assistance. But, you know, all the information that we're providing to you as part of that conservation plan is to keep everybody out of trouble. Because the last thing you want to do is go out there and dig something and hit a fiber optic line in the middle of nowhere. You know, you want to make sure all those bases are covered. Because we're here to help you and protect you as a landowner as well. So that's part of that process. But ultimately, we're just going to make that aware, make you aware that these are the steps you have to do. But it is the producer's responsibility to call 811, things like that. Next. And you hire all the, you know, the contractor, you know, the landowner deals with the contractors that they hire. In a lot of cases, sometimes you as a landowner may be the one doing the work yourself, as long as you know, are following that standard and design. And if it's CTA, there's really not a much that we can really hold you to. We would want you to build a fence to our standard and specs because it's, you know, it's going to last for that practice lifespan. But if you're dealing with a contractor, you know, you would want to relay that information, not to say that we're just going to abandon you in the middle of this process. If there's questions that need to be answered, we can be out there to kind of help, but you as a landowner need to be there with your contractor so we can discuss these, because ultimately that agreement is between you and that contractor, not NRCS. Usually we're working with you as a landowner. We don't work with those contractors. Next. And then, like I said, it meets specifications, standards and specifications, and that'll all be given to you as part of that packet of the conservation plan with the maps, the conservation plan, the job sheets, all of that's going to be in a packet. Next. And provide the proper O&M. That's always very key. We want to make sure that, you know, you're keeping up with that operation and maintenance on any practice that we do. Next. Continuation on the customer roles is keeps the plan up to date. You know, that's part of your responsibility. You know, if things change, you come in, initiate. This is one, just it's in here. If you're getting financial assistance, you know, that's one of those where you would come in and initiate the payment process. I finished my pipeline, I need a checkout, and then we would go through that. Next. Complies with contract terms. Again, this is if you are going through financial assistance. I don't want to get into a lot of this because this is more on the conservation planning part of it. But the reality is that in most cases, most producers that come into our office that get a conservation plan are getting some type of financial assistance. So, you know, this is where they comply with the contract terms and conditions from a financial assistance. This has nothing to do. So those last two bullets have nothing to do with conservation planning unless it's tied to financial assistance. Next bullet. Evaluates the work completed. Next. And then the last step here is to evaluate the plan. And like I said, this is it's an ongoing process. You know, this is long after the implementation of a conservation practice. You know, how effective was it? Did us, you know, putting in a new irrigation system really increase my yield? Did it meet objectives, or does it need to be tweaked? Does maybe the plant field now have to be replanted? We thought by putting in the irrigation system, things were just going to grow. Well, no, maybe you have an issue with soils, it may be a fertilizer, it may be that you need to replant the field. So it's an ongoing process for evaluating the plan. And then the effectiveness, how, like I said, at the end of the day, this is where we want to really work with landowners and get their feedback as to what worked and didn't work. And that helps us as an agency figure out what's working out there. And maybe we need to reevaluate how we maybe implement some of the practices. But that's pretty much a conservation plan in a nutshell. Next slide, of how we evaluate that plan. So what does NRCS do? Next. Again, we provide technical assistance to landowners, producers with natural resource concerns or problems via Conservation Technical Assistance, CTA. And this is free for whatever resource concern you're looking at. You come into your local NRCS office, we'll provide that technical assistance. Next slide. I'm making my pitch here for programs because I understand that we administer also various Farm Bill programs like the Environmental Policy Incentives Program, Conservation Stewardship Program. There's other programs that we administer, but the real key is to get that conservation plan done following those 9 steps that we discussed here tonight. And then it may be something to where in the future we start looking at some of these financial assistance programs that are available, but you still need that conservation plan. That is very key. Next slide. And then we provide technical information to public obtained through research and development. We work a lot with our plant material centers. We're trying to get some more information because sometimes we want to provide you with the most cutting edge technology, seed recommendations. So we work through our plant material centers on some of this. We have one in New Mexico, actually. We're one of the few states, not every state has one, but we have one here in Los Lunas. That's our plant material center. So if there's ever anything that needs to be research, maybe a new variety of alfalfa, we could work with them. We could work with the extension agents through NMSU. Next slide. So this is how we in New Mexico are divided up. We're divided into a north and south area, as you can see on this map. Each of the areas is broken up in, there are 2 area offices, one in Las Cruces, one here in Albuquerque. And then within those areas, we have what we call teams. New Mexico has a total of 11 teams. And in each team, you'll have a district conservationist that, for example, covers an entire team. Within that team, they'll have conservation planners. Those are the folks that you will be working on developing these conservation plans or CTA. It'd be at that local level with those field offices. And as you can see here on this map, that's if you're within, driving distance. And that's not to say that, you're in your places in Cuba, but you live in Albuquerque, you can always go to the Albuquerque field office and then get that process started on getting some of that information out there. But that's kind of how our state is structured as far as providing that technical assistance for CTA in New Mexico. Next slide.
Actually, Kenny, we'll take just a brief pause here, and I'll mention to you that I see a lot of questions in the chat and certainly invite more of those to come in. We'll turn it over to Casey Schooley to offer the producer perspective. So thank you, Kenny. I think it's very clear from Kenny's presentation that he's been at this for a number of years and brings a wealth of knowledge. The few key words I wrote down about Kenny's presentation is that conservation planning with NRCS is voluntary, it's free, it's collaborative, it's thorough, and it's documented. So I'm thinking to myself, gosh, that's a lot of information that you might discuss with a producer, but the good thing is it's all written down. So you walk away with a clear picture of how to proceed to remedy some of the challenges on your piece of land. So thank you, Kenny, and stick around, folks, because we'll take up some of those questions that I have seen coming in through the chat. Next up, I want to turn it over to Casey Schooley. So just a brief bit of background about Casey. She manages farmland with her family near Clovis, New Mexico. And for those of you who are from outside of the state, that's an area whose sole source of water is the Ogallala Aquifer and also sometimes spotty internet. So we're lucky that Casey is able to join us tonight from her cell phone. She found a good location where she's able to speak with us tonight. So she grew up in the South Valley of Albuquerque, still has some family growing some hay there on a small farm. But for the last 30 years, she's been out in eastern New Mexico, and that's where she and her family managed the land that their great-grandparents homesteaded. So that land used to be primarily irrigated farmland, but over the last 3 decades, it's been planted back to native grass for grazing. So Casey says the generational goals for the farm are to continue improving the health of the land and to provide a sustainable and robust environment for grazing. So Casey, take it away. And I see she's on mute, so that might be where we start. It's just that tricky unmute button on a cell phone.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, and greetings to everybody from across the state. Right off the bat, I want to say that the presentation that Kenny just provided was fantastic, and that really broke down every step when it goes for a producer who has to go to the NRCS office for a conservation plan. It's a very simple process. Whenever I have to have a conservation plan here for any of our farm ground here, it's a simple phone call to our NRCS office here in Clovis. I generally speak with either one of the program technicians or their lead person, Delenne. Actually, last fall, I had to call her for a program that we had made an application to that required a conservation plan. It was very simple. I called Delenne. She was able to schedule with me within just a day or two of when I called. She met me out at that particular plot of ground. She and I discussed briefly what my resource concerns were. Specifically, what we were looking at was eradication of love grass, which is a non-native species that was introduced for CRP, which is another conservation program, pardon me. She and I got in my Ranger, we drove around, we looked at this particular piece of ground, she took notes, she listened to what my resource concerns were, she listened to the ways that I had looked at for mitigating this non-native species and things that I didn't want to do, which goes back to what Kenny had discussed, that it really is up to the landowner. But each and every time that I've ever had to work with the NRCS office, it's a very, very smooth transaction. They're there to help the landowner. After Lynn and I had met, she took notes from our meeting, and I went back into the NRCS office after she had completed that conservation plan. We went through each of the bulleted areas of concerns that I had and what our long-term and short-term goals were in order to find some success with that. It took very little time. It is free, and I will also agree with what Kenny said. It's valuable information, partly because his life is busy. Sometimes as a landowner, I even forget what maybe we discussed in a conservation plan, and it's so helpful for me to be able to call the office, either if I've misplaced it or I just need to go back and look at some of the things that we discussed. In addition, they're able to provide me with other people who can answer questions, as well as if I needed them to come back, if there's other issues that have come up. I would encourage anybody to reach out to their NRCS office, go and meet the people that work there, because one of the things I think is important for producers in New Mexico to know, the people that work in the NRCS office, they're your neighbors, and they understand the resource concerns and what's going on in your communities. And so it makes it very easy to talk to them because they do know what is happening within those areas. I don't know what else I can offer other than that, other than I would encourage everybody to ask questions of Kenny. I would encourage you to go into your NRCS office if you haven't. Introduce yourselves and get to know them. These are highly valuable people who have a wealth of information that gives us as landowners the tools that we need in order to try to address the concerns that we have. Thank you.
Thank you for offering that valuable perspective, Casey, as an NRCS customer and client. So now we're to the point of the presentation where we invite your questions. And so we'll be looking, I'll be looking through the chat, but I'm also going to, after sharing with you this final slide from Kenny, just covering some of the components that are necessary to be covered at the end of our presentation this evening. we'll be, I'll stop screen sharing in just a moment so that we can all be on a screen together and go through these questions that might be in the chat and invite people to unmute themselves and ask a question out loud. Kenny, anything you'd like to say on this final slide here?
No, I think, that, we're a non-discrimination agency, there's, if you have some kind of disability, all our offices should be ADA compliant. If you are having issues with maybe hearing, those types of things, we will find the accommodation to help not just our employees, but our producers and find what needs they have so we can get that information out to them.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Kenny. I'll stop sharing and that way we can all be on a single Zoom screen together, and I'll just go through the chat and I'll pitch some questions your way. All right. So I just saw a question about what will be shared after tonight's webinar, and you might have noticed when you first logged in that that you got notification things are being recorded. So however it is you learned of tonight's webinar, I'll make sure to get a recording sent out to those people. So again, through the Drought Learning Network, I'll be sharing that link to tonight's recording. Okay. A great question from Tanya Haig here at the National Drought Mitigation Center. So I'll go ahead and ask you, Tanya, if you want to give voice to it. If not, I'll go ahead and read it out from the chat. All right, so Tanya asks, are there any costs to landowners in putting a conservation plan together, in collecting the data, analyzing the data? Those are just two examples she can think of. So what might be the cost, if any, Kenny, in putting together a conservation plan?
As I said earlier in the presentation, this is all done free. This is part of being a taxpayer in the United States. This is all done free. So all of the putting of the plan together, developing it, getting it into hard copy, collecting and analyzing the data, all of that is done free of charge through the local NRCS field office.
Great, thank you for that. Kenny, are there maybe any notable experiences you had when you were out in the field as a conservation planner that might be a good thing to relay to people who are thinking about approaching NRCS for a conservation plan? Any good experiences that you could relate to them from the NRCS side of things?
I think Casey, made a really good point. Really it's building that relationship and rapport with that local NRCS field office. Like Casey said, there's a lot of opportunities out there. This is one of many services that we offer. Like I said, we're just looking at conservation planning and looking at doing conservation plan. But like I said, we offer a lot of other services like our financial assistance programs, but really the key to getting to that point really is getting that conservation plan developed and documented. And then that helps us down the road when a producer comes in, like I said, to develop and help them, whether it's through just CTA, conservation technical assistance, or if they want that financial assistance, we can guide them into what program fits their needs the best. Sometimes it may be one program, maybe a combination of programs. So, I think the biggest thing is to come in and talk to the NRCS, get to know those folks locally. And then after that is just ask them, if you have an idea of what you think you want to do, a lot of times it's a matter of just going out there on the landowner's land and looking at it, and conversation starts rolling, and before you know it, you're doing conservation planning, developing that conservation plan, and then from there it just kind of snowballs. Sometimes they may just end at that step. They just want to, in a lot of cases, they may just want a conservation plan map, and they may end there, but that's a service we provide. But they may come in a year later or two and say, well, now I need soils information. Well, now I want this. So it's really just building that relationship with that local NRCS field office. And we have really good staff throughout the state. The only hard part I would say, I guess, from a landowner's perspective, some of the comments that I get is that we have a lot of turnover in the agency, and I think that's just government-wide. But in a lot of cases, we do have some of those folks that have been there for a long time, like Delane and others that have been in those communities in those areas, grew up there. So we have a lot of that as well. But probably one of the things that I've heard is that, well, I was working with so-and-so, but they left, and now I'm working with somebody else. That's why it's so key that it's documented. so that next person can take that conservation plan and run with it and not start from ground zero.
Thank you for that, Kenny. I see another good question in the chat from, forgive me if I mispronounced your name, Kimi Ishikawa. And I see that you're unmuted, so you're welcome to just read out your question and add any additional context if you like.
Hi, yeah,
it's from my husband, so he'll speak to it.
Chip Brown here. We're from Wisconsin, retired down here now, starting a farmstead ranch in Pruitt, New Mexico, northwestern New Mexico. But the reason I asked the question is my work was with the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office of Wisconsin, and I ran the regulatory office. And so I'm wondering, do these plans trigger federal rules, particularly cultural resource laws and rules? Because out where we are, we're in a Chaco outlier, and there are many, many, many archaeological sites out here. And so when we implement the plans, I didn't see cultural resources indicated as one of the elements considered in putting together a plan. But is that the case? Are cultural resources considered? Do we need to consider that? Is there an arm's length relationship between us and the NRCS so that when we carry out our plan, we're treated as private citizens on private land and not required to, for example, conduct an archaeological survey or something like that? So sorry if that's complicated or complex, but I'm really curious what your take is on this.
So it all depends. So if we're looking at it, if we're offering financial assistance to any project as part of that conservation plan, then definitely we have archaeologists on staff. We do consult with SHPO, and we have to follow all, like I said, state, local, and federal laws. We have to follow, whether it's for T&E, cultural resources. We have to follow that. If you remember in some of the previous slides, it's going to be the landowner's responsibility if we have to. Now, if it's just technical assistance, we're going to advise you to do that. Right. But if there's no financial assistance tied to it, all we can do is make you aware that there is a process that if you're going to do something on private, again, it is private land, right. But if it is going to be tied to financial assistance, yes, there would be a cultural resource survey, report, we'll consult. It all depends on whatever practice it is. If it's a ground disturbing practice, we would consult with SHPO. Some of our conservation planners, depending on the project, may be the ones. We may have to get one of our area archaeologists to go out there and do a survey, do a report, and then we would send that off to SHPO for consultation. But we have a very good rapport with the SHPO office, and we work a lot with the TIPOs, which are with the tribal, whether it's Navajo Nation, some of the other pueblos. We do work with those TIPOs or those offices.
Thank you. That is what I was hoping you would say. That was thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yes.
Kenny, you mentioned some tribal interaction in your previous answer just now. So I'm wondering if you could speak more to that, how it is the NRCS interacts with producers and maybe even tribal governments themselves on those landscapes.
It's no different. Some of the pueblos, some of the tribes have, landowner requirements that are different than private lands. In a lot of cases, they have like leases on them, but it's the same process. We would work with anybody on whether it's a pueblo or tribal lands. We would work with them. In a lot of cases, when we're working with tribes, it does get a little more complicated because everyone is different and everyone has their own natural resource department that you work with. And in some cases, they want to be very intricately involved. In other cases, they just tell you work with the landowner. And a lot of times they'll review some of those conservation plans. They got to go through their natural resource department. But in most cases, it's the same process that we would do on private lands. It's just that sometimes you have to go through that next layer of working through. And that's really on the producer working with those different natural resources, whatever pueblo or tribe they're working with. They have their process. And in most cases, those district conservationists already know what that process is. So if they're coming in for technical assistance, it's no different on private lands than it is on tribal, other than we may have to work with those natural resource departments based on, and they're all different. I mean, Isleta is different than Sandia, so yes.
Thank you for that. And I'm also just thinking of other governance structures in New Mexico, the complex landscape that we are. So maybe you could also talk about what NRCS does in terms of conservation planning on, say, land that might be a part of a land grant or might be part of an acequia. might be part of a BLM parcel, for instance. So what are the different land types that you all work on, and what does that
Like
look
I
like
s-
for people?
So it could be a combination. It could be where we do what we call coordinated resource management plans. So anytime we're working with like Forest Service or BLM, we've done a lot of work with BLM in the southern part of the state with Restore New Mexico. We've treated thousands of acres of brush management through that. And it's basically developing that coordinated resource management plan in conjunction with, in a lot of cases, when we're working with BLM and Forest Service, we're working with those grazing permittees that may have some kind of issue with water development, maybe brush control. And we work with the permittee with, let's say, for example, the Forest Service, develop that coordinated resource management plan, because it can get really complex. Because if we start getting into financial assistance, we NRCS don't have jurisdiction on some of the federal land, so we can't do the archaeology. That's where the Forest Service has to be on board with that coordinated resource management plan, because it's part of the kind of the conservation plan. Who's going to do what and whose roles and responsibilities are laid out in that coordinated resource management plan. But the good thing is that through NRCS, we can now work on most all federal lands, BLM, Forest Service, and we develop that coordinated resource management plan, and we work through conservation planning. There's roles and responsibilities. So like I said, for example, we would still do the planning on Forest Service land, BLM land. The only difference is that maybe the cultural resource is done by the Forest Service archaeologists versus our internal archaeologists at NRCS. That's just an example, but there's really no cross boundaries. It used to be that at one time when I started, we worked primarily just on private lands, but things have opened up to where now we work. Sometimes we have contracts or we work with producers where you're developing a plan for their private land and their grazing allotment. And it's all part of that conservation plan because it's the big picture. You know, what happens to the cows during the summer months? Oh, they're not on my private land, they're on my forest permit. Well, is there work that needs to be done on your forest permit? So it can get, but it's all part of that conservation planning. It's part of that inventory. It's part of, analyzing what resources, what cards you were dealt, and how do you play with them. And again, giving them that technical advice as to how they want to proceed. So yes, we do work on federal lands, state lands. We work a lot with our state land office. That's one that we work a lot with. And that one's a lot more straightforward. They do have to, there's a process if they're going to do practices, whether it's through CTA or through our financial programs, they have to get some permitting done through the state land office. But in all of those cases, we have a really good working relationship with the New Mexico State Land Office, and those local DCs and planners have people that are assigned to different districts, and they have a good working relationship with whoever that field rep is on those. So those are done in conjunction with the State Land Office. So that's another big partner that we work with because we have a lot of state land in New Mexico.
Yeah, great to hear, Kenny. Thank you. I also want to say thanks to Helena for spotlighting that a link I provided earlier to contact your local NRCS service center or USDA service center rather is outdated. So I'm going to drop something more current in the chat, and you will notice from that link that NRCS has undergone a website update that actually is pretty slick. So there's a more current way of contacting your local service center. I spot a question here from Devlin Wiltbank, and I would invite you to open up your microphone, Devlin, or I can certainly read out from the chat what you've offered here.
Yes, basically I had, I guess, two questions. And I saw in the paperwork somewhere that to obtain a grant that you would need a certain type of sponsor. I think they listed several that were available. And I'm wondering, is the local NRCS, for us in Florida Vista, I think our closest office would be Aztec. And would they be considered a sponsor?
Do you mind sharing the particular grant you're speaking of?
Well, I'm not really sure. And my next question is, can NRCS guide us in available grant possibilities? Because I really don't have any idea on the process. We've just barely become landowners, out of the city. So we're new to the game and just kind of wondering what's out there and how to get this done. So.
Understood. I work for NMDA, so I suspect the question might be about our Healthy Soil program. I'll just turn it over to Dean Bruce. He's with NMDA's Healthy Soil program as well and very technically minded And perhaps he can offer a brief answer on those two quick questions, and then we'll just return to the broader topic of conservation planning, but certainly wanted to answer those questions for you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Specifically related to the Healthy Soil Program, if you're applying for that program as a landowner, you basically have two different options as a project sponsor. That would either be your local soil and water conservation district or a nation, tribe, or pueblo in which you're a part of. And so for that program sponsorship, the SWCDs do work closely with NRCS as kind of partners in conservation. And so you can either reach out to your nation, tribe, or pueblo or your soil and water conservation district for project sponsorship. As far as learning about different grant opportunities and things of that nature, NRCS, as Kenny did mention, do have some financial assistance programs that they offer. And so that's also an option to visit with them about, some federal opportunities there. But your local SWCD may have some cost share projects and programs available as well. So I would recommend building that relationship with both your NRCS office, your SWCD, or the Natural Resources Division of your nation, tribe, or pueblo when it comes to project sponsorship. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. It gives us some avenues to get a conversation going and start learning about that process. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Devlin. Thank you, Dean. I don't see any further questions in the chat, so we would love to give back to you 10 minutes of a Monday night to take care of what needs taking care of in your world. Casey, I'll turn it over to you for some final comments, if any, and then finally to you, Kenny, for some comments to close us out this evening. We hear you.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yes.
I would just again reiterate what both Dean and Kenny have talked about, is to reaching out to those local organizations. NRCS, get to know those people. Again, they are your neighbors. A lot of them are producers within your region, and most of them are from there. Dean brought up a really good point about contacting your local SWCD. Those can be also very valuable resources. And again, those are people that I would encourage all producers across New Mexico to try to become engaged with and get to know who these people are, because we're all here trying to make good decisions, what's best for whatever our resource concerns are within our own small part of our world here in the state. And these people with NRCS, people with NMDA and SWCDs, they can help guide you. And even if they can't answer the questions, in my experience, they're the first people to tell you, if I can't answer that, I'll find somebody who can. And so really reach out to those people and get to know them. They can become just a wealth of information and can help guide you in your goals for what your land, your farm, and your ranch are.
Thank you for that, Casey. And finally to you, Kenny, for some comments to wrap us up this evening.
No, I'd like to thank folks for attending this evening. Like Casey said, I can reiterate, the biggest thing is, if you are thinking about it, is to make contact with that local NRCS field office, work with your soil and water conservation districts, and get the process started. There's a wealth of information. If you go to our website, nm.nrcs, there's a lot of information that you can find there online. Pretty much everything is an open book these days with the technology we have. So if there's anything that people want to learn about NRCS, whether it's even our payment schedules, what we pay for programs, what practices we have, that's that field office tech guide that I talked about. That's all, you can go to that nm.nrcs website. It has program information. It has all the technical information. You can find all types of information on your own by just digging through those sites. We have web soil survey. If you wanted to go out there, it's pretty easy to use. You can utilize that because, again, we are the Soil Conservation Service. At one time, soils is where everything is built from. So you can, start dabbling in web soil survey. That's another tool that's out there available to landowners. It's relatively easy. But again, if you don't want to get into those details, that's what NRCS is here to help you with, to develop that soils map, that soils information, which is key. So I think, with that being said, I'd like to thank everybody for their time this evening. If you have questions, contact one of those local NRCS field offices, work at the local level. And as Casey said, if at the local level it can be answered, it'll come up to the area. If the area can, it'll come up to us at the state office. But we will get you the information that you requested from someone. And thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Kenny. Thank you also to you, Casey, for offering that critical producer perspective. I've dropped a link in the chat so that you can use the map to locate your nearest USDA service center, no matter where you're tuning in from the country. And because this webinar was promoted through the Southwest Drought Learning Network, and the idea for the webinar was born out of that network, I've made sure to include a chat to the DLN as well. So we invite you to check that out and learn more and connect. We appreciate everyone's time this evening and the good questions, and we look forward to connecting with you on a related topic in the future. Thank you very much.